Sometimes, the person you ignore is the one who can change your entire life. Daniel Brooks stood at the head of the conference table, adjusting his tailored suit as sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office, the skyline stretching for miles behind him like a symbol of everything he had built, everything he believed he deserved, and everything he refused to lose. Because in Daniel's world, respect wasn't given freely. It was earned through power, money, and presence. And anyone who didn't meet that standard simply didn't matter, which is why when Emily Carter quietly stepped into the room that morning, holding a thin folder against her chest and wearing a simple navy dress that looked like it came from a clearance rack, Daniel barely glanced at her before turning his attention back to the executives seated around the table, his voice steady, controlled, commanding as he began outlining the company's next expansion strategy, numbers and projections filling the air, until a soft voice interrupted him, hesitant but clear. "Excuse me, I think there's a discrepancy in slide 7. And just like that, the room shifted, not because of what she said, but because she said it at all. Daniel's eyes slowly moving toward her, sharp and unreadable, as if trying to figure out who had allowed this interruption to exist. And when he saw her, really saw her for the first time, his expression tightened ever so slightly, not with curiosity, but with quiet dismissal, because to him, Emily Carter didn't look like someone who belonged in that room. She didn't carry herself with the polished confidence of the others. She didn't wear designer labels or speak with practiced authority. She simply stood there, calm but unassuming, like she hadn't realized she was out of place. And Daniel let out a small, almost amused breath before saying, "And you are?" His tone polite on the surface but edged with something colder underneath. Something that made a few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. And Emily answered softly, "Emily Carter, I just joined the operations team last week." As if that alone explained why she dared to speak. But Daniel only nodded once, slow and dismissive, before turning back to the screen. "Right, well, Emily, we have analysts who've already reviewed these numbers." His voice tightening just enough to signal that the conversation was over, that her input was unnecessary, unwelcome, and frankly, irrelevant. And a few quiet chuckles rippled across the table, not loud enough to be called out, but enough to make the message clear. And yet Emily didn't sit down right away, didn't shrink the way most people would under that kind of pressure. Instead, she held her ground for one more second, just long enough to say, "I understand, but if you look at the quarterly variance." And that's when Daniel cut her off completely, his voice firmer now, sharper. "We'll handle it," leaving no room for debate. No space for her to exist in that moment any longer than he allowed. And finally, Emily lowered her gaze and took her seat, the folder still clutched in her hands as the meeting moved on like nothing had happened, except something had, because from that point forward, the dynamic was set. Daniel Brooks had decided exactly who Emily Carter was, and in his mind, she was nothing more than background noise, someone who should be grateful just to be in the room, someone whose ideas didn't matter, whose presence didn't register. And over the next few days, he made that belief clear in ways both subtle and unmistakable, assigning her the least visible tasks, overlooking her contributions, speaking over her when she tried to offer input, until even the other employees began to follow his lead, treating her with the same quiet disregard, because in a place like that, people learned quickly who mattered and who didn't. And Emily Carter, in Daniel Brooks' world, didn't matter at all. At least, that's what he believed, right up until the moment everything he thought he knew began to unravel. By the next morning, the pattern had already taken hold, and in a place like Brooks Enterprises, patterns turned into reality faster than anyone realized, especially when they came from the top. And Daniel Brooks was the top, the kind of leader whose tone shaped the entire culture of the office without him ever needing to explain it. So when he overlooked Emily Carter, everyone else learned to do the same. Not out of cruelty, but out of quiet alignment, because that was how people survived in a high-pressure environment where perception meant everything, and being on the wrong side of the CEO could quietly end a career before it even started. And Emily, without saying a word, had already been placed on that side, even though no one could clearly explain why, except that she did not fit the image, she did not match the energy, and most importantly, she did not have Daniel's approval, which in that building was worth more than any resume or degree. And so her days became a series of small dismissals that added up in ways most people never noticed, emails that went unanswered, ideas that were acknowledged but never credited, meetings where she was present but not truly seen. And yet through all of it, Emily remained calm in a way that did not quite make sense. She did not push back. She did not complain. She simply observed, listened, and worked, her focus sharp even when no one seemed to be paying attention. And it was that quiet consistency that started to create something subtle, something almost invisible, a contrast that a few people began to notice even if they could not quite explain it, like how she would stay late without making a show of it, or how she seemed to understand systems and numbers faster than someone in her position should, or how she never reacted emotionally when she was dismissed, as if she had already decided that none of this was personal, which only made Daniel's attitude toward her feel even more deliberate, because for him, it was not about her performance, it was about what she represented. And what she represented was a disruption to the order he believed in, a reminder that not everything could be measured by appearance or confidence or presence. And instead of questioning that, he doubled down, reinforcing his perception every chance he got, like during a team review meeting later that week, when one of the senior analysts presented a revised financial model that had clearly been improved, cleaner, sharper, more accurate than the previous version, and Daniel nodded in approval, giving brief recognition before moving on, until Emily spoke again, not interrupting this time, just adding quietly, "The margin projection can be optimized further if we adjust the supplier variance assumption." And for a split second, there was silence, not because the suggestion was wrong, but because it was precise, too precise for someone who had been treated like she did not belong. And Daniel felt it, that brief shift in the room, that moment where attention moved away from him. And he did not like it, not because he felt threatened in a direct way, but because it disrupted the structure he had already decided was correct. So he responded quickly, almost instinctively. That level of adjustment is already accounted for, even though he had not actually reviewed that detail himself. And Emily simply nodded, not arguing, not defending, just accepting the dismissal in a way that felt controlled rather than defeated. And the meeting continued, but something lingered, something unspoken that did not fully disappear, especially later that evening when Daniel stayed behind to review the same financial model more closely. His curiosity triggered just enough to double-check, and that was when he saw it, the exact adjustment Emily had mentioned, not only valid, but significant, improving the overall projection by a noticeable margin. And for a moment, Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, his expression unreadable as a quiet realization formed, not strong enough to change his behavior, not yet, but enough to create the smallest crack in the certainty he had about her. Because the version of Emily Carter he had constructed in his mind did not include someone who could see what others had missed, and yet there it was, undeniable, precise, real, and still. Instead of addressing it, instead of acknowledging her, Daniel closed the file, shut down his computer, and walked out of the office as if nothing had happened. Because changing his perception would require something he was not ready to give. And so the pattern continued. But now, beneath the surface, something had shifted, something that would not stay hidden forever. The following week, the pressure inside Brooks Enterprises began to rise in a way that no one could ignore, because a major partnership deal that Daniel had been negotiating for months was suddenly at risk. And in a company where success was measured in millions of dollars and quarterly growth percentages, even the smallest instability could ripple through every department, creating tension that showed up in tighter deadlines, sharper conversations, and an unspoken expectation that everyone needed to perform at their absolute best or step aside. And Daniel, as always, responded by tightening control, increasing oversight, and demanding faster results. His presence in meetings becoming more intense, his patience thinner, his standards even higher than before. And for most employees, that meant working longer hours, double-checking every detail, and avoiding mistakes at all costs. But for Emily Carter, it meant something slightly different, because while others reacted with visible stress, she remained steady, almost unaffected by the shifting atmosphere, moving through her tasks with the same quiet focus she had shown since her first day, which only made her stand out more in a way that Daniel still refused to acknowledge openly, even though he had not forgotten what he saw in that financial model, even though a part of him had begun to question whether he had misjudged her. But instead of confronting that thought, he buried it under urgency, under responsibility, under the need to keep everything running exactly as he expected. And so when the partnership deal hit a critical point and the projections no longer aligned with the client's expectations, Daniel called for an emergency internal review, gathering his top analysts, managers, and department leads into the conference room. Once again, the same room where Emily had first spoken up, the same room where he had dismissed her without hesitation. And this time, the atmosphere was heavier, more serious, because the stakes were real, the kind that could affect the company's position in the market if handled incorrectly. And as the team began presenting their revised strategies, it became clear that something was off. The numbers did not fully add up. The solutions felt rushed, incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle that did not quite fit together, and Daniel could feel it. That growing frustration that came when expectations were not met, when the people he relied on failed to deliver at the level he demanded, and one by one, he challenged each proposal, asking sharper questions, pushing harder, until the room fell into a tense silence. No one willing to speak next, no one confident enough to offer a solution that would satisfy him. And in that silence, almost predictably, a soft voice broke through again, calm, but certain. The issue is not the projections, it is the structure of the deal itself. And Daniel's eyes lifted immediately, locking onto Emily, as if this moment had been waiting for him, as if everything up to this point had led here. And for a brief second, he considered shutting her down again, maintaining the pattern he had already established. But something stopped him, not respect, not yet, but curiosity, the same quiet curiosity that had surfaced days earlier. And instead of interrupting, he said nothing, allowing her to continue. And Emily stepped forward slightly, placing her folder on the table, opening it with a level of confidence that did not match the way she had been treated. And she began to explain, clearly, precisely, breaking down the deal structure in a way that simplified the complexity without losing accuracy, pointing out where the assumptions were misaligned, where the client's expectations had been misunderstood, and more importantly, how a small adjustment in approach could resolve the issue entirely. And as she spoke, the room shifted again. But this time, it was different. This time, people were not dismissing her. They were listening, really listening, because what she was saying made sense, not just on the surface, but at a deeper level that connected all the missing pieces. And Daniel felt it, that undeniable shift, that moment where control was no longer entirely his, not because he had lost authority, but because someone else had introduced clarity in a way he had not. And when Emily finished, the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was heavy with realization, and for the first time, Daniel did not immediately respond, did not correct, did not dismiss. He simply looked at her, studying her as if seeing her for the first time, not as the version he had created in his mind, but as something else entirely, something he had not yet defined. And in that moment, the smallest crack in his certainty widened just enough to let doubt in, because the question he had been avoiding was no longer easy to ignore. Who exactly was Emily Carter, and why did it feel like he was the only one who did not already know? From that moment on, something subtle but undeniable began to change inside the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way people shifted their attention, in the way eyes lingered a second longer on Emily Carter whenever she spoke, as if they were recalibrating something they had accepted too quickly. And Daniel Brooks felt it more than anyone, because for the first time since she walked into his company, Emily had not only been heard, she had been right in a way that affected everything. And even though Daniel did not openly acknowledge it, he did not dismiss her either, which in his world was already a noticeable shift. And as the meeting continued, he asked a few follow-up questions, not confrontational, not dismissive, but measured, controlled, as if testing the depth of her understanding. And Emily answered each one with the same calm clarity, never over-explaining, never seeking validation, just presenting facts as they were. And when the session finally ended, the solution she proposed was the one they moved forward with, not because Daniel announced it as hers, but because it was simply the most effective option on the table. And that quiet acceptance created a ripple effect that extended beyond the meeting. Because in a company where recognition was often tied to visibility, people began to notice that Emily's input carried weight. even if it was not officially acknowledged. And over the next few days, that awareness started to show in small ways. Colleagues asking her for clarification, including her in discussions they would have previously excluded her from. And while none of it was dramatic, it marked the beginning of a shift in perception, except for Daniel, who found himself in a position he was not entirely comfortable with. Because while he could not deny what he had seen, he also could not easily rewrite the judgment he had already formed, and that internal conflict showed up in the way he interacted with her. Not openly hostile anymore, but still distant, still controlled, as if he was maintaining a boundary he did not fully understand. And for Emily, nothing outwardly changed. She continued to work with the same steady focus, responding when needed, stepping back when not, never pushing herself into the spotlight, which only made her presence more intriguing, more difficult to categorize. And it was that uncertainty that led Daniel to do something he rarely did, something he would not have admitted to anyone. He started paying attention, not in an obvious way, not in meetings where others could see, but in the details, in the patterns of her work, in the emails she sent, in the reports she touched, quietly observing how often her input improved outcomes, how frequently her insights aligned with larger strategic goals. And the more he looked, the harder it became to ignore the conclusion forming in the back of his mind, that Emily Carter was not just capable, she was operating at a level far beyond her position, and that realization did not sit easily with him, because it raised a question he did not like asking. How had someone like her ended up there, in that role, in that position, unnoticed by everyone including him? And instead of asking her directly, instead of confronting the question in a straightforward way, Daniel chose a different path, one that gave him control. He asked human resources for her file, a simple request, routine on the surface, but driven by something deeper. And when the file arrived later that afternoon, he opened it expecting clarity, expecting to find something that would neatly explain what he was seeing. But what he found was surprisingly minimal. Her resume was solid but not extraordinary. Her previous roles consistent but not remarkable. No high-profile companies. No standout achievements that would immediately justify the level of insight she had demonstrated. And yet there were small inconsistencies, details that did not fully connect, gaps that were not large enough to raise concern but not small enough to ignore either. And as Daniel sat there reviewing the information, he felt that same quiet tension building again, the sense that there was more beneath the surface than what was being presented. And for the first time, the possibility entered his mind that his initial judgment had not just been incomplete, but fundamentally wrong. And that thought lingered longer than he expected, following him through the rest of the day, through meetings, through conversations, through decisions, until it settled into something more persistent. Not yet an answer, but no longer a question he could dismiss, because whether he was ready to admit it or not, Emily Carter was becoming impossible to overlook. And the more he tried to understand her, the clearer it became that he had only seen a fraction of who she really was. The more Daniel Brooks tried to make sense of Emily Carter, the less comfortable he became with the version of reality he had been operating in, because everything about her presence in the company now felt misaligned with the assumptions he had made from the very beginning. And in a world where Daniel prided himself on reading people quickly and accurately, that kind of miscalculation was not something he ignored. It was something he corrected. And yet with Emily, correction did not come easily, because there was no clear explanation, no single detail he could point to that would neatly resolve the contradiction, only a growing collection of moments that refused to fit into the narrative he had already decided was true. And those moments kept adding up, quietly but consistently, like earlier that week when a client follow-up report came across his desk, one that had been struggling with inconsistencies for days, and yet suddenly, the structure was cleaner, the logic tighter, the recommendations more aligned with long-term strategy. And when he traced the revisions, he found her name buried in the document history, not highlighted, not credited, just there, as if she had contributed without any expectation of recognition. And that detail stayed with him longer than he expected, because in his experience, people who operated at that level usually made sure it was seen, usually made sure it advanced their position. But Emily did not. She moved differently, and that difference began to shift. How others responded to her as well, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to be noticeable, like how team members began to include her earlier in discussions, how her suggestions were no longer immediately dismissed, how there was a quiet respect forming around her that had nothing to do with titles or appearances, and Daniel saw all of it, even if he did not comment on it, even if he maintained his controlled distance. But internally, the question had evolved. It was no longer just who she was. It was why she had chosen to remain invisible for so long. And that question became harder to ignore the day he overheard something he was not meant to hear. A conversation in the hallway between two senior managers discussing the recent improvements in the partnership deal. One of them saying in a low voice, "Whoever Emily Carter is, she is not just operations." And the other responding, "I looked her up, but there is almost nothing online. It is like she does not exist." And Daniel slowed his pace just enough to catch those words without being noticed, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpening instantly, because in his world, not existing was rarely accidental, and for the first time, the possibility that Emily's presence was intentional, calculated even, began to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a theory he could not easily dismiss. And that theory followed him into the next major meeting, one that would determine whether the partnership deal could be finalized, a room filled with executives, legal advisors, and external stakeholders, all expecting precision, clarity, and leadership. And Daniel delivered exactly that, presenting the revised structure with confidence, walking them through each adjustment, each decision, each projection. And as he spoke, he was aware of something new, something he had not felt before. The subtle awareness that part of what he was presenting had come from someone he had once dismissed, and that awareness did not weaken him, but it did change something in the way he carried the information, more deliberate, more measured. And when the clients responded positively, when the deal moved forward with fewer objections than expected, the room shifted into a quieter kind of relief, the kind that comes when uncertainty is replaced with direction. And in that moment, Daniel made a decision, not publicly, not with an announcement, but internally. He would no longer ignore Emily Carter, not because he fully understood her, but because it had become clear that understanding her was no longer optional. And later that day, as the office began to settle back into its usual rhythm, he walked past her desk, something he had done countless times before without stopping, without acknowledging. But this time, he paused, just for a second, long enough to say, "We need to talk." His tone neutral, controlled, giving nothing away. And Emily looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without surprise, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. And in that quiet exchange, without a single word of explanation, it became clear that whatever was about to unfold next would not follow the pattern Daniel had been relying on, because for the first time since she arrived, he was not the one defining the situation. And that realization, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of a shift neither of them could reverse. The conversation Daniel Brooks had been postponing finally arrived, not with tension or confrontation, but with a quiet sense of inevitability as he stood in his office later that afternoon, the city stretching behind him while Emily Carter sat across from him, composed, attentive, and completely at ease in a space where most people felt pressured just by walking in. And for a brief moment, Daniel studied her without speaking, as if trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the version he had created in his mind weeks earlier. And the contrast was impossible to ignore now, because nothing about her felt uncertain, nothing about her suggested she was out of place, and that realization alone forced him to adjust his approach, even if only slightly. And when he finally spoke, his tone was measured, direct. "The strategy you proposed in the meeting worked. Not quite praise, not quite acknowledgement, but a statement of fact that carried more weight than it would have days before." And Emily nodded once, accepting it without reaction, without satisfaction, as if validation had never been her goal. And that response shifted something again, because Daniel was used to people responding to his approval, used to seeing ambition surface the moment recognition was offered. But with her, there was none of that, only a steady presence that did not change based on how he chose to engage. And so he continued, "I reviewed your work, and it does not align with your current role." A statement that was both observation and question, an opening he expected her to step into, to explain, to justify. But Emily remained calm, her voice even as she replied, "I focus on what needs to be done. Simple, direct, and intentionally incomplete." And for the first time, Daniel felt a hint of something unfamiliar, not frustration, not impatience, but uncertainty, because the answers he was used to did not apply here. And the more he tried to approach the situation through his usual framework, the less effective it felt. So he shifted again, more direct this time. Your background does not explain your level of insight. And that was the closest he came to asking the question that had been building for days. And Emily held his gaze for a moment, not defensive, not evasive, just steady, before saying, "Background does not always show the full picture." And in that moment, it became clear that whatever she was not saying was intentional, not because she was hiding something in fear, but because she was choosing not to reveal it yet. And that distinction mattered more than Daniel expected, because it meant the situation was not something he could control through pressure or authority. It was something he would have to understand on her terms, and that realization created a brief silence between them, one that was not uncomfortable, but charged with something unspoken, something that neither of them rushed to break, until Daniel leaned back slightly, his tone shifting again, less formal, more deliberate. "You have been underestimated." And this time, it was not a test, not a setup, but an acknowledgement, incomplete, but real. And Emily's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, not pride, not relief, just a quiet recognition that the dynamic between them was no longer what it had been. And for Daniel, that shift carried more weight than he expected, because it marked the first time he had allowed his initial judgment to be questioned out loud. And once that happened, there was no simple way to return to the certainty he had before. And yet, even as that awareness settled in, he still did not have the answer he was looking for. The one question that remained just out of reach: who exactly was Emily Carter, and why had she chosen to be here, in this company, in this role, moving in a way that suggested she was seeing something no one else fully understood yet? And as the conversation came to a natural pause, Daniel made a decision that felt unfamiliar but necessary. He would stop trying to define her based on what he already believed, and instead, he would watch more closely, listen more carefully, and wait, because whatever the truth was, it was already beginning to surface, not in a single moment, but in a series of details that were becoming harder to ignore. And as Emily stood to leave, her movements calm, unhurried, Daniel realized something that shifted everything again. This was not a situation he was uncovering on his own. It was one she was allowing to unfold, piece by piece, on a timeline that was not his. And that meant whatever came next would not be something he could anticipate, only something he would have to face when it arrived. The days that followed carried a quiet tension that no one openly addressed, but everyone could feel, as if something beneath the surface of Brooks Enterprises was slowly shifting into place. And Daniel Brooks found himself more aware of Emily Carter's presence than ever before, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer fit into the space he had originally assigned her. And once that realization took hold, it became impossible to ignore how often her influence appeared in the company's progress, in decisions that worked, in problems that resolved more smoothly than expected, in details that aligned too precisely to be coincidence. And while others began to accept this as part of the new normal, Daniel approached it differently, more carefully, watching not just what she did, but when she chose to do it. Noticing that she rarely spoke first, rarely inserted herself into conversations unless it mattered, and that pattern alone suggested a level of control that went beyond simple competence. It suggested intention, and that thought stayed with him the morning an internal announcement was sent out regarding an upcoming executive board meeting, one that had not been on the regular schedule, one that included external stakeholders and senior partners who did not typically attend routine reviews. And while most employees saw it as just another high-level meeting, Daniel recognized it for what it was: a strategic session tied to ownership structure and long-term positioning. The kind of meeting where decisions were made that could reshape the direction of the entire company. And naturally, he prepared for it with the same precision he brought to everything else: reviewing reports, aligning data, anticipating questions, making sure there was nothing left to chance, because in rooms like that, control was everything. And Daniel had built his reputation on never losing it. But as the day approached, something unexpected added itself to his awareness. Emily's name appeared on the internal access list for the meeting, not as a presenter, not as a coordinator, but as an attendee with clearance beyond her role. and at first, Daniel assumed it was an administrative error, something that would be corrected once noticed. But when he checked again, the access remained unchanged, confirmed. And that detail created a pause in his otherwise structured preparation, because it did not align with protocol. It did not follow the hierarchy he understood, and yet it was there, quietly challenging the order he relied on. And instead of addressing it immediately, instead of escalating it through the usual channels, Daniel chose to wait, to see how it unfolded, because by now, he had learned that with Emily Carter, the obvious explanation was rarely the correct one. And when the day of the meeting arrived, the atmosphere inside the building shifted once again, more formal, more controlled, executives moving with purpose, assistants coordinating schedules down to the minute, the kind of environment where every detail signaled importance. And as Daniel entered the conference room, he immediately took in the layout, the seating, the presence of individuals who did not attend standard sessions, confirming what he had already suspected about the significance of this meeting. And then, just moments before it began, the door opened again, and Emily walked in, calm, composed, dressed no differently than usual. Her presence neither announced nor explained, and yet the reaction it created was subtle but real. A few heads turning, a few expressions shifting, not with confusion, but with recognition, and Daniel noticed that immediately, because recognition meant familiarity, and familiarity meant history, something he did not yet have access to. And as Emily took a seat at the table, not at the edge, not in the background, but in a position that carried quiet significance, Daniel felt that same tension return, sharper now, more focused, because whatever he had been trying to understand was no longer distant. It was unfolding in front of him. And for the first time since she arrived, the balance of information had shifted, not in his favor, but in hers. And as the meeting began, as introductions moved around the table, Daniel listened carefully, waiting for the moment when everything would finally connect, when the question that had been building for weeks would finally have an answer. And as each name was spoken, each role defined, each title acknowledged, the room moved closer to that point, until at last, the attention turned to Emily Carter. And in that exact moment, before a single word was spoken, Daniel understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever came next was going to change everything he thought he knew. The room fell into a silence that carried more weight than any announcement, the kind of silence that comes when something long hidden is about to surface. And as all eyes turned toward Emily Carter, Daniel Brooks felt every assumption he had made begin to unravel at once. Not gradually, not subtly, but in a single moment where clarity replaced uncertainty with undeniable force. And when the chairman of the board finally spoke, his tone formal but unmistakably respectful, the truth revealed itself without hesitation. Miss Carter, thank you for joining us. As the majority stakeholder, your input will guide the direction of this company moving forward. And just like that, everything shifted, not only in the room, but inside Daniel's understanding of the past few weeks, because the person he had dismissed, overlooked, and quietly pushed aside was not just another employee. She was the one person whose authority extended beyond his own, the one person who had been observing, evaluating, and deciding while he remained completely unaware. And in that instant, every interaction replayed in his mind with a new meaning. Every dismissal, every interruption, every moment he had assumed control now reframed as a mistake he could not undo. And yet Emily did not react to the revelation with triumph or satisfaction. She simply acknowledged the introduction with a calm nod, as if none of this was surprising, as if she had been exactly where she intended to be from the very beginning. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same steady clarity it always had. But now, the room listened differently, not because her tone had changed, but because her position had, and that difference was impossible to ignore. Over the past several weeks, I have had the opportunity to observe how this company operates from within, without influence, without bias. And what I have seen confirms both its strengths and its limitations. And as she continued, outlining her perspective with precision and control, Daniel realized that this had never been random, never accidental. Every step she had taken, every moment she had remained silent, every decision to stay unnoticed had been part of something larger, something deliberate. And for the first time, he understood that while he had been leading the company, she had been evaluating it. measuring it against a standard he had not known existed. And that realization did not come with immediate reaction. It came with a quiet, internal shift, a recognition that the dynamic he had relied on was no longer intact. And as Emily presented her insights, highlighting areas of inefficiency, opportunities for growth, and adjustments that would reshape the company's future, her focus remained steady, her delivery controlled, never personal, never emotional, but undeniably direct. And when she referenced internal decisions, including the partnership deal, Daniel felt the full weight of the situation settle into place, because he now understood that she had been part of those outcomes in ways he had not acknowledged, and yet she did not call him out, did not expose his earlier behavior, did not use her position to correct the past in front of others. Instead, she moved forward, as if the past was already accounted for, already decided, and that restraint carried more impact than any confrontation could have, because it left Daniel alone with the realization of what had happened, without distraction, without defense. And as the meeting progressed, decisions were made with her input guiding the direction, approvals shifting based on her evaluation, and the room adapted quickly, because in environments like this, authority was recognized immediately once it was clear, and by the time the session neared its conclusion, the structure of power had quietly realigned, not through conflict, but through revelation. And when Emily finally stood, gathering her documents with the same composed movement she had always shown, she turned slightly toward Daniel, not as an employee addressing a superior, but as someone meeting him on equal, if not higher, ground. And for a brief second, their eyes met, and in that moment, no words were needed to communicate what had changed, because everything had. And as she walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence filled with realization, Daniel remained seated, his posture unchanged, but his perspective entirely different, because the question he had been asking for weeks had finally been answered, and the answer was far more significant than he had ever expected, and now, the only thing left was what he would do with it. After the meeting ended, the room slowly emptied, but Daniel Brooks remained seated for a moment longer, not because he did not understand what had just happened, but because he understood it too clearly. Every detail now aligned in a way that left no room for denial, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about strategy, numbers, or outcomes. He was thinking about his own actions, replaying them with a level of honesty he had not allowed before, because now there was no advantage in ignoring the truth, no benefit in maintaining the version of events that had once felt so certain. And as he finally stood and walked back to his office, the environment around him felt subtly different, not because anything had physically changed, but because his position within it had. The authority he once carried without question now shared space with something else, something he had not accounted for. And when he reached his office, he did not immediately sit down or open his laptop. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out over the city that had always represented control, achievement, and certainty. And for the first time, those ideas felt incomplete, because control without awareness had led him to misjudge the one person who mattered most. And that realization carried a weight that was difficult to ignore, not because it threatened his position, but because it challenged his perception. And after a few minutes, he made a decision, not driven by obligation or expectation, but by something more direct. He needed to address what had happened, not publicly, not for appearance, but privately, where it actually mattered. And so later that day, he requested a meeting with Emily Carter, not through formal channels, not through assistants, but directly, a simple message asking if she had time to speak. And when she agreed, they met in the same office where their last conversation had taken place. But this time, the dynamic was unmistakably different, not defined by hierarchy, not controlled by assumption, but balanced in a way that required something Daniel was not used to offering without calculation: honesty. And as Emily entered, her presence as composed as ever, Daniel did not begin with explanation or justification. He began with clarity. "I misjudged you." The words direct, unfiltered, without qualification, and for a brief moment, the simplicity of that statement held more weight than any extended apology could have, because it acknowledged the core of what had happened without attempting to reshape it. And Emily listened without interruption, her expression steady, her attention focused. And Daniel continued, "Not just your abilities, but your position, your intent, and the way you chose to be here. And there was a pause, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if he was allowing the full meaning of his words to stand on their own. And then he added, "That was my mistake." And in that moment, there was no defense, no attempt to redirect, only recognition. And Emily responded in the same way she had approached everything else, calmly, without emotion clouding her tone. "You made a decision based on what you saw." And while the words were neutral, they carried an underlying truth that Daniel understood immediately, that what he saw had been incomplete, and that the responsibility for that was his, not hers. And as the conversation continued, it did not turn into reconciliation or confrontation. It remained focused, grounded in reality. Emily explaining that her decision to enter the company at a lower level had been intentional, a way to understand its structure without influence, to see how it functioned beyond reports and presentations. And Daniel listened, not interrupting, not challenging, because for the first time, he was not trying to control the direction of the conversation. He was trying to understand it. And when she finished, there was a quiet moment where both of them recognized what had changed, not just in position, but in perspective. And while nothing about the past could be altered, the future remained open, not guaranteed, not defined, but shaped by what they chose to do next. And as Emily stood to leave, she paused briefly, her gaze meeting his with the same steady confidence, and said, "Respect is not about titles, it is about awareness." And with that, she walked out, leaving Daniel alone with a truth that was both simple and difficult to ignore, because in the end, the difference between what he had believed and what was real came down to one thing. He had seen what he expected to see, not what was actually there. And that was a mistake he would not make again.